It's just a setback, dear. Happens to everyone, Dad said, his voice thick with that saccharine condescension I'd learned to dissect. He was perched on the armrest of the worn velvet armchair, a position he always favored when delivering pronouncements he expected me to simply absorb. His smile was too wide, too fixed, like a painted mask that refused to crack. I was sitting on the floor, the thick, creamy envelopes still clutched in my hands, their weight a physical manifestation of every ounce of hope I'd poured into them. The silence that followed his pronouncement was heavy, suffocating. Mom, usually the quiet observer, was in the kitchen, the clatter of pots and pans a deliberate counterpoint to Dad's forced cheer. She'd always been the buffer, the one who smoothed the edges of his pronouncements, but lately, her compliance felt more like complicity. This house, this life we've constructed, was a monument to Dad's ego, and I, in my quiet, striving way, had become another piece of his decor, a project to be managed, celebrated, or, it seemed, dismissed. My setbacks were apparently meant to be instructive, lessons in humility for the child who dared to dream beyond the confines of his carefully curated reality. The air in the room tasted of stale coffee and unspoken resentments, a familiar bouquet that clung to me like my own shadow. I remembered the time I'd painstakingly built a miniature greenhouse for my biology project in 8th grade. It was intricate, with tiny glass panes meticulously glued, and even a working misting system I'd rigged up from an old spray bottle and a battery pack. I'd presented it with a nervous pride, picturing the A+ I was sure to get. Dad, after a cursory glance that barely registered the hours of effort, had said, "Nice try. But why bother with all this fuss when you can just buy one? Saves you the trouble." The dismissiveness wasn't the sting, it was the implication that my effort, my ingenuity, was inherently less valuable than his money. It was the same tone he used now, a subtle but absolute devaluation. Then there was the summer I'd spent interning at the local art gallery, hoping to gain experience in curation. I'd been assigned to archive and catalog a collection of antique photography. It was tedious, painstaking work, involving delicate handling and meticulous record-keeping. One evening, Dad found me poring over faded daguerreotypes, my fingers stained with archival ink. He picked one up, his thumb smudging a corner. "You know," he'd mused, not looking at me, "this is why people hire professionals. They have the hands for this. Yours are a bit too soft, wouldn't you say?" He'd then proceeded to talk about his own business dealings, the ruthless efficiency required, the need for a thick skin. It wasn't just about the hands, it was about my perceived fragility, my inability to navigate the real world as he saw it. I'd spent the rest of the evening with a knot in my stomach, the weight of his words pressing down, making my hands feel clumsy and inadequate. The envelopes, crisp and official, felt cold in my hands. One was from the prestigious publishing house, a polite rejection for the manuscript I'd poured my soul into for 2 years. The other, equally formal, informed me that my application for the competitive fellowship I'd pinned my hopes on had not been successful. I'd imagined their words would be a blow, a sharp pain. Instead, it was a dull ache, a familiar thrum of disappointment that had been building for years, amplified now by the casual cruelty of the reaction. Dad had already seen them, tucked away on the hall table where I'd left them in a moment of bewildered exhaustion. He'd picked them up, his eyes scanning the logos, the official letterheads. And then, the laugh. It wasn't a hearty, empathetic laugh. It was a short, sharp bark, devoid of humor, laced with something that sounded suspiciously like amusement. 2 rejections, he'd crowed, tossing them back onto the table as if they were scraps of paper. Told you this writing nonsense wouldn't get you anywhere. Stick to something practical. He'd then turned to Mom, who had emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a carefully blank mask. "See, Martha? Always dreaming. This is what happens when you let them live in the clouds." He'd winked at her, a conspiratorial gesture that made my stomach clench. "Don't worry, dear," he'd said to me, his voice dripping with false pity. "Maybe you can get a job at the local library. You'd be good with books, wouldn't you?" The air in the room thickened, each word a tiny shard of glass lodging itself beneath my skin. Mom hadn't said a word. She'd simply walked over to the wall where our family photos were displayed, a curated gallery of milestones and manufactured happiness. Without a word, she'd taken down the framed certificates of my academic achievements, the photos of my graduations, and, almost reverently, she'd pinned up He2 rejection letters. Their stark white envelopes, stark against the beige wall, seemed to scream their message. It wasn't a warning to me. It was a declaration. My father, the architect of my perceived failures, was now a gallery curator of my public disappointments. And my mother, his quiet accomplice, had provided the velvet rope. The sheer, audacious humiliation of it all settled over me, a cold blanket. My dreams weren't just setbacks, they were to be displayed as cautionary tales for anyone who dared to witness the domestic drama. The air in the house changed after that. It became thinner, sharper. Dad, emboldened by what he clearly perceived as a victory, became even more dismissive, his pronouncements laced with an almost gleeful certainty. Mom, however, was a different story. Her silence was no longer complicity, it was a humming silence, pregnant with an unexpressed purpose. I saw her meticulously going through old boxes in the attic, her movements slow and deliberate. I heard the faint rustle of paper, the soft click of a drawer closing. Her warning had landed, not as intended, but as a catalyst. It wasn't about shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. Those were his tactics, the loud, performative displays of power. My approach had to be different. It had to be silent, precise, and utterly devastating. I remembered the conversations we'd had about the house, the one I'd grown up in, the one that was technically in both their names. He'd always referred to it as my house, an extension of his own dominion. But there were clauses, little legal safeguards I'd insisted on, buried deep within the property deeds I'd had my lawyer draft years ago. Safeguards against precisely this kind of entitled, dismissive ownership. One Tuesday morning, while Dad was at his golf club and Mom was at her book club, I arrived at the house. I didn't drive my car. I took a cab, and I carried a single, thick manila envelope. The house was quiet, eerily so. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the darkness of my intention. I went straight to the study, the room where Dad conducted most of his business, the room where he'd often held court, dispensing his wisdom and his judgments. On his mahogany desk, amidst the scattered papers and expensive pens, I placed the envelope. It was thick, heavy. Inside, a single, folded document. A pre-approved mortgage refinance application, detailing a substantial equity release. Attached, a certified copy of the marital settlement agreement from their first, brief, and highly contentious divorce, a detail Dad had always preferred to forget, a secret he'd buried so deeply he believed it had ceased to exist. It outlined his obligation to provide Martha with a specific percentage of liquid assets in the event of divorce, a clause he'd signed with his typical arrogance, assuming he'd never have to honor it. He'd remarried Mom, but that original agreement, buried and seemingly forgotten, still held legal weight. It was the foundation upon which his entire financial empire was built, and it was about to crumble. I didn't linger. I didn't need to see his face. I didn't need his reaction. My revenge wasn't about his humiliation, it was about the quiet restoration of balance, the reassertion of a power he'd so carelessly assumed he alone possessed. I walked out of the house, leaving the envelope on the desk, a silent bomb waiting to detonate. The fallout was swift and deafening, albeit in a muted, domestic way. Dad's golf buddies started whispering. Mom's book club friends, usually so polite, suddenly offered unsolicited advice about financial planning and legal counsel. The frantic texts started arriving within hours. What did you do? Your father is furious. This is a disaster. The flying monkeys, as I'd come to think of them, were deployed. My aunt, a woman who had never spoken to me in years, called, her voice laced with fake concern, asking if I was handling this whole mess. But the true unraveling wasn't in the panicked phone calls or the thinly veiled accusations. It was in the subtle shift in the house's atmosphere, the way Dad's voice, usually so booming, became strained. It was in the chilling silence that followed his attempts to brush it all off, his usual bluster faltering against the cold, hard reality of the legal document. I later heard, through the carefully constructed grapevine of our extended family, that the refinance had been immediately frozen, that the original divorce decree had been unearthed, and that the house, the symbol of his financial prowess, was now under scrutiny. His ability to control, to dismiss, to dictate, it had all been systematically dismantled, not with anger, but with a quiet, irrefutable logic. He had used my rejections as his exhibit A of my failures. Now, his own carefully constructed legacy was on display, a testament to his hubris and his oversight. The warning had been hung up, but it wasn't for me. It was a prelude to his own undoing.